Welcome to Awakening the Body, conversations around sexuality, psychedelics, trauma, shame, acceptance, and loving self-kindness. How can we bravely co-create safe enough spaces for our erotic and ecstatic selves to emerge and flourish, opening up to radical self-love for our weird, wonderful, and full beingness? I'm your host, Rachel Charlie, somatic sex educator, living in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, on the unceded Indigenous lands of the Kongam Mohawk Nation. This 11th episode is a conversation with Natasha Salaash around de-colonizing parenting as a foundation for touch, intimacy, and pleasure. This conversation begins with Natasha's experiencing living in Kenya with the Maasai tribe on and off for 5 years, and how watching their ways of being with children opened up a process of change from the inside out in her own relationship to her children, and also her relationship to herself with touch, intimacy, and finally a grounded relationship with her own sexuality. As I was putting the podcast together and re-listening to our conversation, I was struck by the concept and work of decolonizing the body and the self. We didn't use that term in our conversation. It comes from Indigenous and BIPOC wisdom. It is a path we can all engage in to potentially re-engage with our bodies, our emotions, our felt sense of working with conflict, of love, and of community and connection with humans and the more than human. Natasha's journey is gorgeous, slow, and profound, and I know it continues through her work in sexuality, through her relationships with her family and loved ones, and her ways of being in the world. When Natasha was 20, she witnessed female genital mutilation firsthand in Kenya and realized that a part of a woman's power comes from her right to pleasure. Uncomfortable with this right for herself, it took over a decade before Natasha began her journey inwards, reconnecting to her innermost self, her right to pleasure, and then supporting others to do the same. Today, Natasha holds space for clients as a sex and intimacy counselor, intimacy coach, Betty Dodson certified body sex facilitator, orgasm coach, breathwork facilitator, body awakening, and genital de-armoring practitioner. You can find links to Natasha's websites in the show notes. And if you're interested in financially contributing towards this podcast, you can buy me a coffee. The link for that is in the show notes. Thank you, and thank you for listening. I hope that you enjoy this episode as much as I did. Hey, Natasha, it's so great to have you here and so great to be with you and have you on the podcast.
Hi, Rachel. Yes, I'm very, very excited to be here and really honored that you invited me to share today.
Yeah, we've got there's all these things that we've just been thinking about covering that are really kind of complex and cool and fun. And maybe we'll start a little bit with your earlier life, but also grounding it into you've been working in sexuality for a long time now.
Mm-hmm.
And in a real variety of ways that are really beautiful and changing for the people that come, but also probably pretty changing for you as a human as well. Yeah. So these are the things that we want to bring in. So on one of your websites, one of the favorite parts of it, and I'm going to read it here that I have, and it really struck me, is that when you were 19, you traveled to Kenya and lived with the Maasai tribe on and off for 5 years. And you learnt a style of parenting. At the time you had one child for some of that. I think you ended up having how many? 4 or
5?
5 children, right? Right. So, and you write, and this is my favorite. This is my favorite part. You wrote, through attuning to their your children's physical and emotional needs, that you discovered that you lacked attunement to your own needs. that really struck me.
Yeah. Yeah, it was really a monumental point in my life. I think when it was actually through touching them that I realized, I think it was probably 3 or 4 children in,
Mm.
that um, I worked so hard. I put so much emphasis and attention on attuning to them. I could, I knew different sounds and cues of what they needed. I knew what it meant before they cried, and I could respond really fluently. And then, yet it was in touching. I wondered, what are they feeling from my touch when it's coming from really an empty vessel? I felt like I loved them so much, but I had no idea who I was, or had no real connection to myself. So, what actually are the people I love feeling from my touch? And so that was kind of sparked my devotion to filling my own. The image for me was a teapot, actually, because I love tea. In Kenya, tea is a big ritual that marks points in the day. And so I thought, yeah, you can't pour from an empty pot. And so even if I'm attuning and listening, what do they feel from me? And it really horrified me. So I decided to devote the same practices that I use to attune to them, to my own self and my own body, to discover it was what it was that I want and need and feel.
I'm curious if you found out like what did they feel from you and how did that change as you changed? You might not know the answer to that, right? It's a pretty
Well, it's amazing. I've seen as they grow different traits that they've learned from me, and some, not my best qualities, some of the things that I've really struggled with, patterns that they've just absorbed like
yeah.
through osmosis, really. So, and then, but also since this big change in my life where I've really focused not only outward on other people's needs, but really in attuning to my own, I noticed, yeah, it impacted their confidence, their rightness in their body, um, just the potential for what's possible, I think, in their belief
Mm.
systems even. Yeah, I was embodying more of what I was trying to offer them.
Mm.
Yeah,
And so by turning into yourself, it changed you.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I want to get back to that, but I'm just curious like what is there anything around the what you learned in Kenya with this style of parenting that really struck you that you wouldn't have learned if you had stayed in Canada?
I mean, everything, honestly. Like when I first was around them, so I went just on a whim kind of. I mean, I was fascinated to learn about other cultures, and I got this opportunity to learn about theirs. And at first, there was only a couple men who spoke English, so they were teaching me about different ceremonies and stuff, mostly involving men and some involving women, but secondhand.
Mm.
And it was interesting, but what I found more interesting was watching the mothers interact with their children, and seeing the babies never cried. In my whole 5 years there, I have one memory of a crying baby. And I couldn't understand at first what was going on and why the children seemed so content and so happy, so confident in their body. And at first I thought they were really spoiled, actually. I thought something was wrong because babies have to cry. And I remember when I started learning the language, I asked the women about this, and they said, crying baby is not the norm, although sometimes some babies do cry, but it's the exception, not the norm. And that, I mean, in the West, babies cry. Crying is synonymous with babies.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was a big piece. But the longer I stayed, the more I saw these same children grow into these confident, capable, children. And I thought, okay, there's something these mothers are doing.
Mm.
And I remember one day a mom sitting with a woman under a tree, and she just all of a sudden put her baby to the side, like a 6-month-old baby. It peed, and she brought it back on her lap. And just how did she know that baby had to pee, you know?
Mhm, mhm,
But she knew before it peed on her. And I'd see this time and time again with a mom with a baby on her back. She'd take it off, pee, and put it back on her back. And so this level of attunement, that I'd never seen anything like it in my life. And they were always, somebody was always with the babies, whether it was the mother or another sibling or another co-wife or another woman in the village, largely women, but a baby was never a solitary being. It was always with somebody. So I realized the proximity was gave a clue into how they were learning all these clues. I thought of dogs, sometimes you can think your dog might have to pee or something and you let it out. It's very similar, but I'd never realized that you could recognize that in a baby.
mhm,
So it was a combination of keeping the babies close in proximity, as well as the mother's intuition, and just noticing, being curious to the language the baby is speaking and interpreting it accurately, really, so that
mhm,
the baby learns that their needs are reciprocated and responded to.
mhm. And it probably changed your relationship with your children like quite a lot.
Absolutely. So then I became very passionate about this, even before I had my children, and knew that I would raise my children this way.
Uh,
And so with my firstborn, so in the West, they call it attachment parenting because they have these pillars sort of of attachment parenting. And it's the closest I could come to find in our Western society, like the closest connection to that parenting, but it's still not quite a fit. But the close in proximity is essential to be able to attune to the baby. So
mhm,
co-sleeping, baby wearing, breastfeeding on demand, just really listening and responding to the child's needs.
mhm,
So, yeah, so I did that with all of my children. One of my children is adopted as well, and she was adopted as an older child, around 5, and so it was a way, applying all those same principles to an older child was a way to help her attach and connect to me and my husband. So, yeah, and I mean, moving forward, it's just trickled into, it's sort of the baseline or the foundation for all the work I do, I feel like, as well, in sex and intimacy.
yeah, yeah, it does. It feels like the foundation of all intimacy and sexual intimacy. And it is kind of almost, I mean, it makes perfect sense to me that it is. And it's also like the kind of taboo of children sexuality. And like it's such a strange place I find the cultures that I've grown up in around all of this. It feels so wrong, so much of it. And what you're talking about feels really, when you talk about this and this way of parenting and being, my body's just like soaking in the goodness
Yeah,
of that possibility, right?
absolutely. Even I my favorite way of touching is, as an adult now, is focusing on the sensations of the body I'm touching. So not for a goal or anything, just to feel the fat, the hair, the moles, the sensation in the body. And I always think that's how we touch babies. We don't touch to demand anything of them. We touch to feel the, like, the chubbiness, the rolls, like it's just like butter, just perfect sensations in the fingers. And from that, it occurred to me that, like, that is for many of us, but unfortunately not all of us, our initial um, imprinting of pleasure would be in that touch of our mother's hands, wakening up all the nerve endings, showing our body what's possible. So with that kind of loving touch, ideally on a naked body, I mean, we swaddle babies so much in the West too,
Mm-hmm,
that,
mm-hmm.
an embrace of fabrics and stuff, but ideally that's an imprinting of pleasure right from the mother's hands.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's kind of like you said as well, like you were wondering what you felt like an empty vessel. So the mother's hands need to have some of that inside themselves as well.
Exactly, exactly. You can only do so much from an empty vessel. Yeah, even with the right intention.
Yeah. And like I know a little bit about your story, your life, and I'm just like saying, so to actually feel that it as an adult to fill our vessels, it involves intimacy and sexuality. And I think this, I'm don't know for sure because I've never asked you the question, like this way of this intimacy and this touch, maybe it brought you into um, more respecting your own personal pleasure for yourself.
Absolutely. I mean, it was actually, I applied that touch to myself to attune to my own body. And and at first it was really hard. I was extremely disconnected from my body. I loathed it. I felt disgusting. And so it took a bit. I mean, I did all the things. I set timers, like intentional practice of an hour of this, a lot of boredom. And then eventually my body started telling me stories, the stories of my life through my fingers. I
Yeah.
felt like the lines in my face, and I remembered my time in Kenya and the sun, and like the strength in my shoulders from carrying babies, and the stretch marks on my stomach, the lips of my vulva. And it was all like, yeah, it was just like a storybook of the most like vivid imagery. And I was like, wow, I feel so good to touch. Like anybody would actually be really, really lucky to touch this body of mine. And like stretch marks that I'd hated and loathed actually create like an incredible texture playground
So
to the
beautiful.
fingers, right?
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
grooves and the like wrinkles. So it took a while. It was not overnight. It was months. But eventually I started really appreciating my body. And then, I mean, and that was pre even learning to masturbate with my hands. I had to learn that and discover. And that was another level of this is disgusting. And then, no, actually, this is amazing. So it was really, I just so believe in the power of touch that's present and
Mm.
non demanding, non goal orientated.
Yeah. Yeah. And it reminds me of something that Marika once said, who you know very well, um, is that she was talking about like self touch and just saying like, and you might not feel anything at first, but maybe you might be bored, but maybe the skin is sleepy. It just needs time to be woken up. Like be patient. Give yourself that.
Absolutely. Well, and even I imagine like when I'm touching somebody who is wanting that, they're come for the intention of waking their body. I imagine like little tiny lights underneath the skin and just like turning on ever so dimly and building with each stroke of the finger. It's like really beautiful imagery, and I believe it's really true because if I believe every baby is born with that longing for
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
touch, that physical contact.
Yeah.
And if they didn't get it, I mean, the pain of that longing has to be suppressed. It's so deep.
It's so deep.
So yeah, but it's still in there.
And it's like if we haven't been touched, like just all the nerves just need time to regrow, reorganize so that they can be available to that touch in the
Exactly.
body.
Yeah, it's so exciting, really.
That, well, I find what's so exciting is even as adults, if we haven't received that, we can still wake it up,
Exactly. Yes.
right? Even
Exactly.
75, we can still wake our bodies up. Like it's never,
Yeah,
ever too late because our bodies want that.
exactly. I exactly. It's like it's a special magic.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, like, so you did all of this, you woke yourself up, but you were also like working with like growing your children, right? In all the ways that people are aware of, but especially in the ways of touch.
Mhm.
And you discovered like touching yourself. And I know you did a training with Betty Dodson, which is kind of special around this. Like, when did that come to your awareness or even capacity to do right?
Well, it was really the big sexual changes and the touch, actually. Your questions just remind me of timeline a bit, but happened after my last born was finished nursing, about 2 years old. I had no longer any children to distract me, like babies that need so
Yeah.
much
Yeah.
attunement and care. There, I still had children, but
Yeah.
and I was confronted with honestly just myself. And I'd always wanted to be a mother. It's like the most important part of my life, and yet there was an element of me avoiding myself in it, and so I was confronted with myself, and that's when I began the practice of self-touching. And I was married at the time, and we our intimacy was not mutually pleasurable, and um, yeah, and I started reading books on pleasure and feelings and breath, emotions, orgasm, everything, and I found Betty Dodson's book Sex for One, and I was like, okay, this works for me because I don't need a willing partner in this. I can explore myself and discover what I want. And also, it really, there's nobody to blame. I really like that aspect too.
Yeah.
Like, I
Yeah.
have no idea what I like, what I want. So, how can anybody else?
Yeah. Well, how
So,
can there be mutuality if you haven't discovered yourself first?
exactly.
Mm.
So, yeah, and I didn't, still, I mean, I thought masturbation was cheating. I had a childhood masturbation method of like rubbing against socks kind of thing. And so, but here I was an adult and I never orgasmed in sex and I didn't masturbate. So I was like, no, I have a right to my own pleasure. I want to
Mm.
feel pleasure. So that took me to New York, and it was the first to Betty's workshop, and she was just starting the facilitation process. So I was actually
Mm.
the first person to get to be certified as a body sex facilitator, and it just opened so many doors for me, in just one, in accepting my body because they're nude workshops, and yeah, owning my right to pleasure with other women because we're sharing pleasure, self pleasure together in a
Mm.
group. So it was profound, like just huge. I mean, lots of the times I just wanted to scream from the rooftops, like, I feel good, I orgasmed, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. And there's also been lots of other learnings and a continuity of the work in sexuality, different changes, refinements, over the years. Like, I don't even know what a lot of them are. Like, do you want to talk about that, or do you want to go into something else? Like, I'm happy with
Well,
that.
sure. Yeah. Well, so basically, so I did body sex, and that was really my calling, my passion. But in the workshops, in the group, I noticed so much sexual trauma, and a lot of the women had experienced. And I just felt like, okay, I need more understanding in this.
Yeah.
While I'd had endured a lot of sex I didn't want, I wasn't ultimately consented to all of it, if that makes sense. Like, I was never raped, or I was consenting to sex I didn't
Yeah.
want.
Yeah.
And so I ended up training as a sex and intimacy counselor, never planning to do that work,
Mm.
just to support the workshops. And the workshops spread, and I'm in kind of a rural area in Saskatchewan. Everybody said it would never work, but it did, and brought me
Yeah.
to Quebec to meet people like you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, yeah, it just spread, and the counseling grew, and I ended up really liking it. And I mean, it's not traditional counseling. Um, and then, I did trauma-informed practitioner training and then breath work. So my trainings kind of mimic, I think, my own evolution.
Mm.
Breath, pleasure, breath orgasms, all of that. So, and all of it, just my work just kind of expands and forms around the different things I learn about myself, and then get more practical training in. So, and then most recently, genital de-armoring, which I realized I'd been doing with clients for a long
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
Wasn't, wasn't that specific model, or I hadn't called it that. So
It's kind of hard to avoid.
it
If
is,
we're
yeah,
doing this work, it's kind of like you can't miss it. It's going to
exactly.
happen whether you know what's happening or not.
Exactly. It was just sort of like, oh, this is what de-arming is. Well, I know what this is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
So I do a combination of I do counseling, I do breath, like using breath for pleasure or breath for feeling emotions. I also do body work involving like awakening, body awakening, I call it.
Mm.
So reconnecting those nerve endings. Um, and it's also a kind of therapy that really helps with like erectile dysfunctions and people who have a problem with being too in their head. It's like sort of training them to focus on their body. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's a very, very, very big problem.
Yes. Very, very big. Yes.
Yeah. And just not being in the body and wondering, what am I doing wrong with sex? Why am I having all, why is it not like really good? And it's like,
Absolutely.
because sex comes from the body.
Yes.
Maybe, because there's that question of what is sex. And I was kind of thinking about, you've been thinking about, I've been thinking about, and there's so many answers, and maybe you said it. And maybe that's where my new answer is coming. I think you said this, whatever, it actually is really something that comes from the inside and the body. What was the thing that you said? I think it was
Yeah.
exactly that.
So what I said, yeah, because you asked me that question when we were sort of leading up to
Yeah.
this. And I went for a walk and I thought, what is sex? And yeah, and I thought, or I think it was what you asked me, what's a healthy sexuality or something? And I thought, well, really, without the connection to our felt sense, what is any of it? It's all just like acts or, it's things. Yeah,
Pleasing,
yeah. But the
soothing,
felt,
keeping a relationship.
yes, exactly. But the felt sense of what the attunement to the self, the felt sense of what my yes and no is, what I want, what I don't want, that's the baseline for all sex to me, is being connected to that. And
Mm,
with that, I can do whatever I want, and my what I want will be different than what you want, but that's like kind of like icing, really. It's more
mm,
like
mm,
the deeper ingredient
mm,
is that connection to the felt sense. And so many of us do not have that. Like I was in
mm,
my 30s before I reconnected to that.
mm.
But also interesting, a baby is born with only that. They don't have
I
frontal
know.
lobe development.
I
They
know.
don't have the cognitive thought. It's all the felt sense.
Yeah.
So in our parenting, intentionally or unintentionally, often we learn to like disconnect from the felt sense
Mm.
and do what other people want us to do. So it all really comes back to that formative relation.
Different kinds of abuse, different kinds of trauma, different kinds of violence in families, sexual abuse. It's even, we move further out of our bodies, even.
Exactly. Exactly.
And it's really about coming back. Like sexuality, I think it's just about coming back to the body and trusting that.
Yes.
And a lot of self work, but also with
Yeah.
other people you can do it. But just that self touch.
Yes. It helps us like re-inhabit the body, and I mean, for a lot of us, it hasn't been safe to be in the body,
Yeah,
right? If there's
yeah,
been sexual trauma or violence, yeah, it's not safe to feel.
yeah,
So we have to learn, yeah, to connect to that and that we can be safe.
yeah,
That was then, but this is now, and now is different.
yeah. And then doing it like really slowly with a lot of care. Like
Yes.
I find that with a lot of my work, it's a lot of like really, really checking in slowly stuff, and then finding
Yes.
something, being like, okay, I'm not going to do it that way, and
Yes.
finding any safety in the body at first,
Exactly.
or even safety outside of us, like looking around, like finding what, like it's tricky work.
Absolutely. Just something to anchor to.
Yeah, something to begin, something to find an original anchor so that it can just come back.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes, exactly. In my de-armoring training, there was a something he said, slow is the fastest way.
yep,
And that's my absolute favorite line. I just love, love, love that. Slow is the fastest way.
I
There's
love
no
it too.
other way. Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. Because so then, did you say what you thought the definition was? Because you said it earlier, and I'm forgetting if you just said it just
Oh,
then.
yes. So the connection to the felt sense in the body as sort of as our wisdom for what we want, what we don't want, what we're okay with, what we're not okay with sexually.
Right, but that's great. But then, what is it that what is the thing that we're engaging in that's called sex? Like, what defines that? I can
Yeah, that's
help. I can help a like this is this is not.
sure you can help because yeah, I need another walk to process
Yeah, and
that.
this is not from me either, right? This is
Okay.
what
Okay.
has been one of my favorite definitions, but it's still it's really good. It's from Betty Martin
Oh,
from the
beautiful.
book with Robin Delson about the will of consent.
Mhm.
And it says, by sex, I mean the presence of your own arousal and the decision to follow it. If it involves another person, and I'm just going to add in or people, they are also following their own arousal.
Hmm. Beautiful.
It is beautiful. It still doesn't answer all my questions.
No, I do like her emphasis on the like it need to be a bit selfish, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but we have to, yeah, we have to follow and be responsible
Mm,
for our own arousal, and
mm,
if we're stuck in our head, we're not gonna that's
mm,
not gonna work. So I like that part. Yeah, I don't know, the energy, the like mm, yeah, I don't know, there's definitely energy is like a key word, what sex is for me. Because of course
mm,
sex, it can be ourself, like you said, another person or people. And there's this sharing and accumulation and dance of energy,
mm.
regardless of what parts of the body are being used.
And
Because
this is where it gets confusing because if we open it up to include the whole body, which I think is really important,
absolutely.
then it gets confusing to me because, like, I really like that definition and I've stuck by it for a long time, but now I have a lot more questions. I I talked about this like a year ago on my first podcast, and it was still what I don't know what the fuck.
Yeah.
But there was some really, and the other people on that gave really good ideas, and it was really good. But it's kind of like lately, like for me, I notice if I'm alone or even in a group of people, but not interacting with anybody, like having like psilocybin or ayahuasca or something. So this is me. Like I had an experience on mushrooms. I think I was alone where every single finger of mine was individually having an orgasm, right? And
Right.
then now it's more global. Like I'll feel it in so many, it feels like orgasmic states. I don't know if it really is, but it feels like it's, or maybe it's a different way of being in the body that can be extended to all of life. And it doesn't have to include my genitals, but I just feel this like central line and it's opening and closing. Total orgasm, close, breath. Total orgasm, close. And is that sex or is that something else? Like, I don't the fuck know. It feels like really good sex, my
Oh,
definition of whatever that is, but I don't know.
oh, I mean, that sounds like phenomenal sex to me too.
And to
Absolutely.
me, I rate like sex in other definitions, cultural definitions of sex, it's a particular act that can be
Yeah.
pleasurable or not pleasurable. It can be violent, it can be non-consensual, and it's still that act.
Right.
I don't like that. And for
No.
me, it's like if my finger's having an orgasm and everything's just yummy, like that's like this is sex. And if I'm doing that with another person and my finger's having an orgasm with them and I'm holding them close, like that's sex. That's
Yeah,
sex.
no, absolutely. It's interesting you mentioned the like rape or sex without consent because somehow that didn't even figure into my definition.
No,
Oh, no, that's a really, yeah,
yucky.
that's not sex at all. It doesn't even deserve to be in the realm of the conversation around it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, but I'm bringing it in because I'm just thinking, like,
No,
what do
yeah,
other people think it is? And
right.
I know that my ideas around it are really kind of like out there for a lot of people.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
even the idea that I can have an orgasm in a finger. I mean that
right.
it's just like
Yeah,
ridiculous. Let alone on the anus or other more
right,
traditionally accepted places, right?
right. Yeah,
Like,
no. Well, I think, okay, there's a piece for me of using the energy in my body or and the whoever I'm with or if I'm with myself. So there's a body, like the physical self connection of building that into something that goes beyond the body. I think I would say actually, where it becomes more just energy.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
actually, but to me it starts with the body. Like the body is like the connection to my body, the connection to the sensations. Um, that stimulation takes me beyond that, but that's the
Mm,
starting point.
mm,
Because whether it's self-pleasure or pleasure with my husband, eventually it's like, yeah, it's just like you said, orgasms in the fingers. Like it's just so
yeah,
its
yeah,
energy is
yeah,
so,
yeah.
yeah, you
And
know,
then
and
that feels like orgasm to me, like or a kind of orgasmic state. And then, but sex doesn't have to have orgasm as well, or that
yeah,
state. But there is a special place where I,
I love
yeah,
that you're geeking out on it. Yeah, like this is definitely, I'm going to be thinking about this because
because
it's a really interesting question. And I
because
know most,
orgasm and sex and pleasure, like it sounds like we're talking about pleasure. It sounds like we're talking about what I would call entering the state of the bliss body. And
yeah,
we can be in those experiences while we're washing the dishes. So,
yes, that's true. But I can think of those as sexual too. Like, or I can be in nature and have that experience. But to me, the pleasure piece is more interesting, I guess, than the orgasm. And I mean, there's
mhm.
no orgasm as good as like that high state of just like continual pleasure.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. And that
yeah,
pleasure, it moves places in the body. Like you can stay in the genitals, like we can do that, for sure, but it can also move. And it can also like it's like there's so much emphasis on the genitals. There's so much we understand so little about the genitals. They're so hidden and misunderstood and shamed in our cultures. So I don't want to not include them because wow.
hmm
And but then it's almost like some people the only place they might feel on their body is a part of the genitals and
yeah,
everything else is closed to sensation and yet everything everything is genitals. So
exactly.
this is a
Everything.
really I think I think I have an idea that there's so much sexual trauma and by that I mean culturally
hmm
that I don't think we really understand what our bodies are capable of, how to be in the bodies, most of us, and what pleasure actually really is. And actually, I don't think we're going to know what sex really is or have a good definition of it for a long time because I got to say, I got a lot of ideas. I could talk for hours about it, but I don't the fuck know.
No, no.
And the
Yeah,
more I learn, the less I feel, the less I actually get it.
yes. Yeah. Well, and I notice in my work, I mean, definitely most people I work with think of sex as some kind of connection between genitals. whatever the genitals are, but that's, I mean, a lot of people would think it's like penetration, but still, just even like a bit broader is just, it's definitely genital interaction.
Yeah. Which is beautiful,
Yeah,
personally. I'm just gonna
yeah,
say,
but limiting. If that's the
if
only
that's all,
definition,
yeah,
it's very limiting. Yeah, and I also think like just like I love the body, I love the sensations of the body, but to me, just the body is limiting too. Like there's so much beyond that too, like just energetically in the bliss states and stuff.
yeah.
But I still think we need the body and we need to be grounded enough even to go into those states. You need to feel safe to
Mm, mm.
go
Yeah,
there.
to be able to go there. And I find, like, I don't really know, like, because we both have our own separate experiences and I don't really know. But I find that there's so much, like, it's almost like there's infinite space inside of me.
Yeah.
So I find I'm rooted in the body completely, and that allows me to, I don't know what it is, right? So
Yeah.
it's kind of like I need to be in those states, and it's been a slow process and it continues, right? Like
Mhm.
it's a mystery. So maybe this is more a practice of dying. Maybe this is more a practice of living,
Right.
and learning to be human and learning our capacity than what like mainstream sexuality is usually relegated to.
Absolutely.
But I feel like the places I go, I don't know what they are. It doesn't feel like dissociation, because some people could just say, oh, it's dissociation, which is also a gift and has its blessings.
Mhm.
But it's like I need to be out. The more I can feel everything right now, the more I can be fully with all of my emotions as they change and as they grow larger, right?
Yeah.
The larger they grow, which is complex, the more I have capacity to hold the space inside my body, to hold that, to hold pain, to hold
Yes.
the unfortunate things in my life, the more I have the capacity to be in pleasure, the more I can grieve. And I found this process to also be a process of deep grieving.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I don't know if it's sex anymore.
Right. Well, again, the definitions are so limiting that it's one of those things. It's like an existential question or something. Like, what is it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And maybe it's best to just keep that word to something really limiting, so it's easy to define, and then talk about this as something else, like a
Yeah.
process.
Yeah.
Because I was wondering about that. I'm thinking, wow, I'm including this orgasmic state that I go into, that my genitals are there. They're not the main thing. And it feels more like a connection with everything that is. So
Hmm.
maybe I shouldn't be calling it sex anymore.
Yeah. A
Like,
connection with everything that is. I like that.
I like calling it sex just to be naughty,
Yeah.
just to kind of like push it a little bit, like
Yeah.
just to kind of break open
Yeah.
narrowly defined ideas of sexuality and the whole way that so many of us have learnt sexuality through pornography.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
just want to break it all open, like say,
Yeah.
I just want to
It's
put a pin in it and just burst it open.
yes. Well, again, it's just so limiting and just confined to this one part of the body. Whereas, as you said, every part of the body is a genital, really. It can be woken up to feel the most exquisite pleasure. Yeah, and it's yeah, just so sad to limit it. Yeah. But they're a wonderful tool. Like they're an access point, but it's not the
Mm.
only, for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So that's the what is what is healthy sexuality question.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll be thinking about that one for a while.
Well, actually, one thing and actually, what is intimacy? Like, what is closeness with another human? What is intimacy with someone that has access to that we share access to our bodies in all the ways? Like, what is intimacy? I should have given you a heads up about this because,
That's
man.
okay. Well, to me, the intimacy is the connection with the innermost, and the innermost is the deepest part of ourself. So the root of the word intimacy comes from a Latin word intimus, meaning innermost. So the innermost layer of a vessel or deepest part. So I always think beyond my bone, my physical bone structure, like deep inside me. It's in the soft, tender tissue. It's it's that the baby I was born with, like all the felt sense. It's like my desires, my longings, my dreams, but it's deeply vulnerable, and that's why it's covered in exoskeleton, and because it's very vulnerable. But to connect that, well, for me to tap into that within myself, I'm connecting to this innermost me is intimacy, or to open that and share that part with another
Mm.
is intimacy with them. So yeah, to me it's really that the deepest innermost part of ourselves.
And the way you're describing it is kind of the way you describe like the learning about touch is if you haven't received the kind of touch, then how can you give it
Yes.
or even receive it from another person?
Hmm.
And the intimacy you're describing is first well, I don't know if you had an order, but they're both important. The intimacy with the self is the ability you have to access that is the capacity that you have with another person.
Absolutely. And it makes me think of, again, infancy and babies. when they're safe enough they attune to themselves, which means to notice the changes in the baseline felt sense of their body. So like a feeling in their stomach could signify hunger, or like needing, like vulnerability could signify they need to be held or whatever. But there's a baseline, and they notice shifts and changes in it. So that attunement to themselves causes them to reach out and express to the people who love them, like, I need something. And
Mm-hmm.
that response is intimacy. And it sets the foundation for it right from birth, ideally, if that's the
Mm-hmm.
way it
Mm-hmm.
works, for that response. And the parents, they're learning. So they're helping the child learn their own language of what they need by accurately interpreting the needs. So if it's the parent's agenda, that's not intimacy. They're not really attuning.
So what you're talking about, this process, is a similar process to your relationship with your children and the way that you were with them that you learned. Do you feel like you've been through a similar process with what intimacy is to you as well? Because we were talking about touch before, and intimacy is connected with touch, but it also has separate qualities, maybe.
Yes, yes, definitely. I mean, like you said, I recognize that, I don't even know who my innermost is. I don't know where I'm touching from. Like, does it feel like just an arm suspended in the air, touching in all these ways, or does it come from, what does it come from? Like, I don't even know myself.
Mm.
And so, yeah, it was really developing intimacy with myself to be able to have it with others. And then again, that connection to myself, that's also that piece of healthy sexuality, or that piece of that felt sense where I can feel that innermost, and I navigate all my sexual experiences through that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
And the more connection and safety you have, the more that you can have the ability to turn back from something that's not serving us, for example.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, but without the safety, we're just navigating from the armor
Yeah.
around
Yeah. Yeah.
it, and we all have the armor. It's just self-protective. We've developed it because it hasn't been safe to express from our innermost consistently through most of our lives. So, but then again, now we have more options as adults. So that was then, this is now. Can I
Mm,
take down that armor to have the intimacy that I long for?
mm, mm. And
Whether
even
it's
just,
like
yeah,
little bits or big bits. Maybe we just open the shield a little bit, you know?
yeah, yeah. And it's great to have that compassion around it rather than blaming or shaming or feeling shame yourself around it. Like just it's I really love that we can have this conversation like this. It gives me hope, right?
Yeah.
Because I think of me as a younger person trying to navigate the world and the amount of stigma and shame and armoring and lack of safety. I think that in some places some things have changed. Like I have a lot of hope because we've been doing this work, others are doing this work, our teachers have done this work, our colleagues, friends, and it feels like this curious leaning into what's possible.
Yeah.
I really, so yeah.
Yeah. And it is so hopeful. Like it's so hopeful. And just that we can always change these things, you know, no matter what the conditioning was, the potential and possibilities are there through
Mm,
corrective experiences with, you know, therapists or loved ones or yeah, the
yeah.
possibility is always there. It's in our imprinting, I believe. It's
Well, it
yeah.
feels like there's a I'm going to sound weird. Like there's a core blueprint. No, this is not weird. There's a core blueprint in our bodies that our bodies, all the parts of us, I'm just using the word body here because it's easy,
Yeah.
that leans towards, that is constantly, when it can, when it has the space, just asking for that, trying to do that. And then when we can give it that space, there is this kind of coming together that it wants to do. We want, I don't know, we want to do.
Yeah. I like that, the blueprint. I couldn't agree more. It is
It,
that.
yeah. And it can feel really hard to access, right?
Yes.
But
Yeah.
with the right kind of situation around us, the kind of relationships that we can lean into that feel compassionate and safe enough to just have a little bit of wiggle room,
Hmm.
like these things can happen.
Yes. Safety with a nudge, you know? So
Just a
it's
little bit.
not, yeah, you know, just a little bit uncomfortable. Yeah.
Mm, mm,
Yeah, safety with a nudge.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just
Mhm.
looking to see like what other ideas do we have to talk about. Um, a few ideas like maybe do you have it like I have an idea, but do you have anything you want to like have as a last, like we got a little bit of time left, maybe we could talk about a couple more things if you want or not. Do you have anything in particular?
No, I don't actually. I'm really interested in what you're interested to ask me or to talk about.
So we've actually been talking about like what is sexuality, but we put it in this really big context that
Hmm.
began with a way of parenting, right?
Hmm.
And self-touch and what is intimacy. And so there is a really important part of our body that we talked about that is neglected and overused. But when I use the word used, like, I mean, I think this part of our body does get used for quick nervous system regulation, for quick release, for quick, I feel okay, or just for like, give me pleasure, give me pleasure, give me pleasure. I need it, I need it, I need it. And that's the genitals. Like, and because I know that this has been a big part of your work, right? As it
Hmm.
is mine, do they matter?
Yes. Um, yes. And they aren't the only thing. Um, I really, I feel like our genitals are incredibly sacred. I mean, even just saying that is like emotional for me. It's just, it's divinity. It's a beautiful gateway into ourselves. I just really hold genitals in very high reverence as a very sacred part of our body, and our sexuality. And yet they're not the only part or the be all end all. And I think a lot of times they're so abused, and not even in the way that people would think of abuse. I mean, just the way we demand things of them, the way we criticize how they look. There's a lack of compassion. So I mean, I think that that heart genital connection is incredibly important. Um, and it's like, I don't know, maybe like the taproot or something that everything else extends off of in the tree or something, you know? It's essential and important, but it's not all.
Yeah, because when we think about the genitals, I always include the anus, external anus, internal anus. Sometimes I even include the bladder, but like all the because one of the things I love about the idea of arousal is with arousal, it opens up all of our water. It opens up all of our fluids. And our bladders are really important for that, especially when we have like a urethral sponge. Right. Yeah. So it's like I really, even the kidneys, maybe I'll include. You see, this is me.
Right. So then it just expands, right?
Yeah.
Again,
and definitely like prostate if you have one, definitely like womb, definitely like ovaries, definitely like the inguinal canal, definitely like a lot of internal stuff as well. And a lot of things that I don't think we really know because there hasn't been a lot of real research into actually the anatomy. Like I know Gil Headley's done a beautiful work, dissection work that includes the genitals, and that's like we know so little. It makes me feel like they're so misunderstood. I know, like, when do anuses ever get examined by a doctor? Actually, when do men's penises ever get examined by a doctor? Like, there's so little we know, and then they're so kind of used as well, and it's kind of like this I don't know, this dichotomy, these two things that don't go together. Yeah. Like real, like actually pleasure doesn't go with the shame.
No.
It doesn't go with the not beautiful. Like it doesn't go with the not knowing what they look like. It doesn't go with not understanding them and not giving them touch that's not about seeking orgasm.
Yeah, exactly. Non-demand. Yeah.
And I don't know. Yeah, I find a lot of my work is about touch without looking for orgasm at all.
Absolutely.
Like,
no. Yeah, same with mine. Yeah. Well, and I mean, a lot of times the only time our genitals have been looked at is to make sure there's nothing wrong, or because we think there's something wrong.
Or because there really is something wrong as well, right?
Yes. But it's not in reverence often, or connection, or so. Yeah, there's a lot of inadvertently and intentionally too, a lot of shame just to put on them. When you were talking about the how the word genital can expand, so deep internally, kidneys and all that. The other, that brought up actually the throat for me, the throat and jaw.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
What are genitals without the throat and jaw? So, and I mean, in utero, it all is connected. So, and anytime I'm doing body work with people, I'm always working with the jaw and throat as well, to soften and so it's again, everything is not simple. It's just so expensive, which is the beauty of it. And it's who knows who's right.
And it's good to be a little more expansive about it because a lot of the knowledge that I've had in the cultures I grew up with and has been so reductionist and so separating of everything and putting everything into pieces. It's actually really important to actually be able to see the person as a whole being.
Absolutely.
And yes, the genitals are down. You can't see, they're down there. And they're kind of also like, I can still feel my genitals while I'm doing this, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's important to make it expansive. I agree. And I mean, I so wish, like most of the people I work with, I mean, it's a part they mostly largely ignore, except for to try to make it look more presentable for other people, smell more presentable for other people, perform in the way that they want it to so they can feel like they're functional and a normal person. But it's not really an appreciation or connection. And so it's kind of like a discouraged child. You abuse this child and you yell at it and everything, and then it's like, but do the thing I want you to do. Like, maybe not.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. Is there anything else? So on the show notes, like I'm going to put links to your website, I think.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And anywhere else you want me to, so people can find you if they want easily.
Mm-hmm.
And is there anything you want to finish with, or anything you have that you want to say still?
Thank you so much for inviting me. Yeah, I was really looking forward to this. I love how your expansive mind and your curious questions, and I knew it would expand mine as well, just through what you asked me. So it's very stimulating and orgasmic, really, bringing me beyond myself. So thank you so much, Rachel.
My pleasure. I'm so glad we could do this. It's just been lovely spending this time with you.
Me too.
You can find my services for individuals both in person and online on my website. If you enjoyed this podcast and want to financially support this work, you can buy me a coffee. Both links are in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening to the 11th episode of Awakening the Body with Natasha, Salaash, and your host, Rachel Charlie.